That's just kind of how policymaking works. Like most people who are trying to make the world see things the way they see it, the way to do that is you keep repeating your point over and over again, and you figure out how to tell it in a way that like is compelling to people. Could we make it the case that there are levels or something like this of what amount of compute comes with what amount of responsibility? Maybe there's a future where like lots of countries have lethal autonomous weapons, but we want to make sure that these lethal autonomous weapons are sort of acting in accordance with, or at least like not grossly going against international law.
The Inside View. The Inside View.
The Inside View.
Markus, you're the head of AI policy at the Centre for the Governance of AI in Oxford. You were previously seconded to the UK Cabinet Office as a senior policy specialist and GovAI's deputy director. There's a lot of things happening at GovAI right now, and I'm really excited to have you today. Thanks, Markus, for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's begin this interview with AI policy takes, true or false, a game where I tell you AI policy takes from Jack Clark on Twitter, and you tell me which ones you agree or disagree with. So for some context, Jack Clark is the co-founder of Anthropic and recently published a thread on Twitter, a goldmine of AI policy insights. The actual thread was something like 1 like equals 1 spicy take on AI policy. So this is one of the tweets. The real danger in Western AI policy isn't that AI is doing bad stuff. It's that governments are so infinitely behind the frontier that they have no notion of how to regulate. And it's unclear if they even can.
For most of these, you'll struggle to have me say like, oh, agree or disagree, because everything's nuanced and whatnot. I think it's right insofar as like the things I care primarily about is how do we make sure that we can deal with future systems that sort of will crop up, and they'll be more powerful and more capable than the systems we have today. If that's the case, that like we can't handle the systems that are cropping up today and the harms that they're creating, then that's a bit worrying about how we might be able to handle future problems. I also think it's the case that like, and I think this is true for a lot of the Jack takes. They're more true for the US than for the rest of the world. Like in other parts of the world, people are figuring out or trying to regulate AI. The EU is like a big example of this.
Yeah, but I think most of progress in the AI is in the US, right?
I think like primarily if you think about like frontier development, yeah, definitely like the US is like the main place.
New take. The notion of building general and intelligent things is broadly frowned upon in most AI policy meetings. Many people have a prior that it's impossible for any machine learning-based system to be actually smart. These people also don't update in response to progress.
I think like somewhat agree. I think it's true that this is a thing that like not a lot of people want to talk about, or that's like associated with sort of like sci-fi or whatever. I do think that people will like are probably like in the course of changing their minds as they start seeing models that are more general. And if it's the case that the development of these AI systems moves in the direction of like systems continue to be more and more general and more sort of capable, then I think we should expect like more people to update in this direction. So I think like we're seeing a bit of updating, and I think like if the world goes in a certain direction, we'll continue to see a bit more of it.
Another take. The default outcome of current AI policy trends in the West is that we all get to live in libertarian snow crash wonderland, where a small number of companies reward the world. Everyone can see this train coming along and can't work out how to stop it.
Yeah. I mean,
are we in libertarian snow crash wonderland?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't read Snow Crash. I'm assuming that the thought is something like, we'll live in a world where like all the power lies with a small number of corporations. Those corporations sort of determine what happens in our lives. We're sort of beholden to them. I don't know. I mean, firstly, I wouldn't expect everyone to be seeing this train coming. If that was the case, then like why are we not stopping it? Or like in that case, you could like, maybe the world could coordinate or whatever. Or everyone could be like look around and realize everyone else agrees, and then you could do something about it. I also don't know the extent to which we'll end up in that kind of world. Like one reason against that is like, if we just look at the history of like other technologies, like quite often a thing that you see is like initially when the technology comes into place, there is sort of concentration of sort of the wealth accumulation as a result of this technology and sort of power into a small number of actors. And then over time that diffuses partly, if it's the case that like partly via like government intervention. So like, for example, I think we saw this in the like late 1900s or like late 1800s, early 1900s, when sort of like in the US of like the robber barons that like are the reason that we now have antitrust regulation in the US. And if if it's the case that like development is sort of slow enough that like policymakers are going to see this stuff happening and sort of yeah, this power is going to be concentrated and people will see that and be really worried about it, then I would expect that sort of you start moving away from this snow crash wonderland after a little bit.
AI policy can make you feel completely insane because you will find yourself repeating the same basic points. Academia is losing to industry, government capacity is atrophying, and everyone will agree with you and nothing will happen for years.
I mean, that's probably true. I think in general, that's just kind of how policymaking works. Like most people who are trying to make the world see things the way they see it, the way to do that is you keep repeating your point over and over again, and you figure out how to tell it in a way that like is compelling to people. And that's this whole business. Maybe it's extra bad in the AI policy space. I don't really know.
To get stuff done in policy, you have to be widely specific. CERN for AI, cute idea. Now tell me about precise funding mechanisms, agency, ownership, plan for funding over long term. If you don't do the details, you don't get stuff done.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think this is I think this is like the kind of work that I'm the most excited about in the sort of AI policy space is people trying to just do that kind of thing. Just go really, really specific, think through all the details, because like there's a ton of people in the world who will spend like 5 or 10 minutes or maybe like even an hour thinking about an idea. There are very few people who will like actually spend like, a week or several weeks or years thinking about an idea and like figuring out all the ins and out of it. And that's your way to have a comparative advantage and like actually be able to like be informative to people. Everyone can spend that hour thinking about the idea,
Yeah, I think now some people are trying to like translate a bunch of ideas from the AI safety or AI alignment space to like concrete like policy to tell the US government. Now to move on to AI governance takes, another format where I ask you questions from Twitter, asked by my followers, and you try to give some quick answer. Some of them are AI governance takes, some of them are AI policy takes. Can you like maybe give a quick definition of the difference between policy and governance?
I mean, it's a bit, people use it in a few different ways. Sort of at the center for the governance of AI, often we've used sort of governance to mean something like the entire space of what affects actions of important actors in the AI space and what can be done to change those actions in positive directions. That's sort of how we've defined it. Sometimes I've defined it as something like, oh, there are like all these things that like need to be done to make sure that like AI goes well or that AI benefits humanity. Some of those are like technical questions of like how to make AI systems meet such and such criteria. And then AI governance is everything that's not that. And then on the policy side of things, I think people use this word in a few different ways as well. Sometimes people use it to just refer to what governments do. So sort of government policy or public policy. I tend to use it a little bit more vaguely to mean something like what should various actors do. And so you might have sort of like internal policies at sort of AI labs or whatever that they might follow, for example.
Do we need a new federal agency for regulating advanced AI?
Yeah, I don't know. I think this
is a valid answer.
I think this is a thing to figure out. I think like it depends a lot on how this technology evolves. If it's like a general purpose technology, if it's like electricity, then like probably we don't need that much like a central like one regulator for all of AI. Instead of what you need primarily, maybe is like all of your regulators across the entire economy understands how this technology is going to affect their space, and they gain the knowledge to be able to sort of deal with that. If it's the case that sort of we see some more sort of like the development is like sort of more centralized, or there's like a few systems that end up being very, very impactful, or we end up in a world where like foundation models are used in like across the entire economy, but there are a handful of foundation models. In that kind of world, then I could imagine that you need some like AI specific regulator that specifically deals with these questions.
Imagine there's like a regulator watching this video. What's a foundational model?
So foundation model, this is like a new concept that came out of, or sort of a new, some people will call it just like branding or whatever. So there was a team out of Stanford, this is this sort of research organization there for human-aligned AI. And they are, basically the idea is that there's like, you have one model that has been trained on a huge amount of data that can be used in a very, very wide range of contexts. That's sort of the rough idea of what a foundation model is. And then their claim is that over time, or sort of that we're seeing a trend towards these foundation models mattering more and more. And so like the claim is that the way that the sort of AI ecosystem might look in the future is that like you have a handful of really, really big models that are like pre-trained. So they've been trained on like a whole bunch of data. And then those models are adapted to like fine-tuned or whatever to other contexts. Yeah, that's roughly. And then some AI people will say that this is just branding on the part of Stanford, and that like you could just use terms like a base model, so like a foundational sort of model or a model that's at the base of your tech stack, that you then build things on.
Yeah, I think we've seen like a bunch of people adopt big models, so large language models, to like fine tune them on like different other tasks. And this is like the kind of term started, I think, in 2020 or 2021. And I guess this paper from this Stanford group started this term like foundational models, and then since then people have been using it. So you talk a lot about like different worlds. So if we're in a world where we have different agents, different actors with strong AIs, and on Twitter they care about a world where AI timelines are short. So maybe you can start by talking about what we mean by AI timelines, etc. But the question is, suppose we're in a world where AI timelines are very short and takeoff speeds are very rapid. Let's say fast takeoff and AGI in less than 8 years. As the AI governance community produce any plans that will meaningfully decrease risks under the scenario. So lots of unpack here: timelines, takeoff speeds, AGI. No need to go into like big definitions, but like simple ones.
What they mean here by like AGI, I guess, is something like maybe at some point you'll have systems that are sort of an individual system, and that system is sort of sufficiently intelligent that it can sort of improve itself. It can sort of find new data in the world. It can figure out how to like rejig its weights, or sort of find new data to train itself on, or find ways to access more compute to train itself on, or sort of implement itself into. And then the thought is that you have that kind of system. That kind of system is very sort of people use the word like agenty. So it's a system that like takes actions in the world and it plans in the long term or whatever.
AGI is artificial general intelligence. If someone from the OECD is watching this,
yeah, exactly. And so then the thought is that maybe like if you believe that these kinds of systems are possible, like then the thought is that like maybe those systems will sort of have a very fast takeoff speed. This means once the system gets to a certain level of capability, it manages to sort of improve itself very, very quickly. And so it might go from like sort of a human level intelligence or like close to human level intelligence, however we would try to measure that, to something much more capable. And then timeline is just a term that people use to mean something like time between now and when you reach some certain like level of capability. Often like a metric that people will use is like human level machine intelligence, maybe something like that.
So the question was, assuming the short timelines, fast takeoff, as the AI governance community produce any plans to reduce risk from AI?
I think probably, and like to some extent, like I don't like this framing of like producing plans, because it has this sort of very, I don't know, like stodgy or like sort of inflexible feel. I guess my view is like, if it's the case that like, if I now, you gave these three criteria of whatever, of what this world looks like, that's very little information about what that world is actually like. And I would imagine that like the right actions to take, or like what we should do in that world, or what sort of how things might go well, or sort of how an actor might act responsibly, will depend a lot on the like specifics of that world. A bunch of other facts are going to matter. And so to some extent, I think that like what it looks like to prepare for that kind of world looks less like, given XYZ happens, we should do these other things. And that it might look a little bit more like one term that I've heard people use, which I think is useful, is something like maybe it looks like a playbook. So it's like, if the world looks like so-and-so, or if like these parameters have these values, then we do this. If they have these other values, then we do that. Like if you believe that like the government would be like very, very competent and like figure out this problem really well, then maybe you're like, oh, okay, let's just tell the government what's happening. And then maybe that would end up like things would go really well, or like it would also depend on like who has this system or whatever. So I think it depends on a whole bunch of things. I do think that there has been a bunch of work that looks like that I'm confident would be helpful if one could like see this coming down the pike, or like saw this down the horizon. I don't know how much there's like someone having put together like here's my 5-step plan, assuming that such and such thing happened.
Is there anything being done to prevent a literal arms race
in AI?
Yeah, assuming people just start scaling models up and the question mentions medium and long timeline, so it's not very like short scenarios, but
I think this is like a really important topic. I think a bunch of people are thinking about it. I think a lot of the frame that or like one classic frame that like a lot of people will have when they think about these things is they think something like, okay, well, we're going to develop these systems. These systems are going to be very capable and they're going to be very like economically useful. And then it's going to be the case that like making sure that these systems, it could be the case that like making sure that these systems do what you want them to do, make sure that these systems act in alignment with sort of their users' intention or sort of in alignment with like human values or something like this. The thought is that that might sort of put you at a competitive disadvantage. If that's true, then we might have a problem because in that situation, the actors that sort of don't take those safety precautions or don't sort of make sure that their system is sort of promoting human values or sort of not causing harm or whatever, those actors are sort of put at a disadvantage, and then the actors who are less responsible end up sort of developing the technology and then maybe gaining all this economic value and gaining a bunch of power or influence over the world or whatever. So that's like a general framing of what a lot of people who think about sort of how to govern or what policies to put in place to deal with potentially much more capable AI systems. What is being done about this kind of thing? I think there's a few strands of work. I guess we'll come on to this later of like my view of like what's happened in this space. But like examples of things that you might do that seem good are like you might want to like right now start thinking about like, oh, in like 20 years time, what might a reasonable international agreement on AI look like? Or you could start doing things like, oh, we want to make sure that like the relevant actors, they trust each other. Because if they're going to start imputing bad intentions on each other, if they believe that the other actor is going to like act really irresponsibly and they're going to like, even if they develop these very powerful systems, they're not going to use them for good purposes or whatever, then they're going to be much more likely to say, okay, well, it's worth it for me to take this hit on safety or sort of act less responsibly or sort of develop my system less carefully because it's really important that I make it there first. That seems like a worrying situation to me.
What do you mean by taking a hit on safety?
They like decide not to spend, like in the ideal world, maybe like before you deploy a big model or a model that you think might be dangerous, maybe in the ideal world, everyone could just like take a step back. Maybe you take it easy for about a year, and then like you have a bunch of people figuring out whether the model is might cause some harm or might cause a problem. Like if we were in a world where like I don't know, all of humanity was just one dude, then like then it would make a lot of sense for that person to just be like, okay, I've now developed this system, and then before I deploy, I'm going to spend a few years figuring out whether it's good or not, and then I'm going to deploy it. But we don't live in that world. We live in a world where there's a bunch of different humans. They have different interests. They want different things. And so you're going to have competition, and that might cause problems.
So we might be in this world where DeepMind develops AGI first, and then OpenAI, because of their charter, decides to, move to DeepMind and like help make their system safe. And if they have like enough advantage in like their development, they can just like spend maybe not a year, but like 2 months making it safe.
Yeah. So you could imagine that those kinds of things happening. Or like, maybe like if it's the case that these kinds of systems are possible and that they will be developed, then like it seems that those kinds of solutions seem great. And so then like things that you want is like you want these actors to trust each other enough that kind of thing could happen. Maybe you want them to like in advance, such as like what OpenAI has said is what you said. So basically like if they believe that someone else is like sufficiently close to developing, I don't know what term they use, maybe they use AGI. Then we're gonna realize that, or we're gonna like accept that, and then we're gonna like join forces with them. Other things that you can do that I think is important is just like, I think overall we should expect lots of the important actors in this space, partly because of these competitor dynamics, to take the accident risk or like the risks from developing these models or deploying these models less seriously than they should. And so one thing that seems very important in general is just like make sure to communicate those risks in good ways to those actors to make sure that they like I don't know, like an example is like it seems great for it to be the case that like militaries don't involve AI systems very, very closely in their like nuclear command and control to like make decisions about like launching nuclear weapons. One of the main reasons that this seems great is because if you do that with present day systems, they're going to be too brittle and they're going to like not be able to deal with all of the different situations that might be thrown at them. And so the accident risk is going to be really high. And then my guess is that like that is, and so like given the sort of advantage you get in sort of time to launch or something like this, just isn't worth it from the like sort of accident risk that you're incurring. And I think that might be the case with a bunch of different actions that that these actors or that like sort of developers of AI systems might take going forward, where like the accident risk is just like big enough that it's not even in their self-interest to sort of take a certain action.
So we need to convince them that it's like close to what nuclear weapons are.
I mean, yeah, if it's the case that these technologies are close to nuclear weapons, then yeah, you would do that kind of thing. Or like, yeah, and I think the thing that you can do now is you can like do a bunch of work to just like explain what these systems, like the problems that these systems might have and the risks that they might that you might incur if you start using them too much, or if you don't like use them more like responsibly enough or whatever.
There are other examples where technology has been regulated. So, for instance, GMOs in Europe. Do you think there's like something similar that could happen with AI for slowing progress?
GMOs seem like based on my very like cursory understanding, it seems like a case where people were like public opinion turned against it enough that like development was slowed down a whole bunch, especially in the EU. And it could be the case that similar things happen with AI. To what extent do I think that will happen? I don't think the effect will be as large as it was with GMOs or with nuclear or like nuclear power, because like I think these technologies are more, I don't know, you might like AI is more like omni-use, like it can just be used everywhere, and like it's currently being used in a whole bunch of products already or whatever, and like people also don't like viscerally feel the like where it's being used. And then like another big thing is like both nuclear, I think, and GMOs, they kind of pull at this like disgust reaction that humans have. Like you don't like eating something that's poisoned or whatever. We've been evolved to like not be disgusted by things that like that might be poisonous or whatever. And I think both nuclear and GMOs kind of pull at that. And AI doesn't quite have those features. It has a little bit of that via like maybe people are worried about like these systems being sort of very inhuman and making like important decisions about my life or whatever. And so I can imagine those kinds of things leading to regulation or whatever that like slows down the progress.
I think at some point we'll get AIs automating a bunch of our economy and people losing their jobs. And when like 50% of the economy is automated by AI, people will start having some disgust against it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I guess I don't know. Yeah, maybe that's not quite the disgust reaction being pulled out, but it's like an anger reaction or some kind of something like that. I think that seems like if that ends up happening, then I think that will be like might be a really, really important factor in like how AI technologies are deployed and developed in various countries.
So we've talked about an AI arms race from scaling models. Do you think we can regulate the amount of compute people train?
I think a promising thought is like, okay, if it's the case that like in the future, the amount of compute used to train a model is like one of the most important proxies or one of the most useful proxies of the capability of the model, then I think that's also going to be one of the most important proxies of the like potential impact of the model, because with more capability comes more sort of more possibility of causing harm. And also more possibility of sort of making like doing good things in the world.
How I think Uncle Ben in Spider-Man would
exactly,
say,
yeah.
With great power comes great responsibility.
Exactly, I think that's right. I think that is just like a claim that is true and is something that like is also kind of embedded in a lot of regulation or how we do like policy or like do regulation and whatnot in the world at large. And so if this prediction is true that like compute is the best, like one of the most important proxies with capability, then I think that will a very like a promising direction will be doing things like, if we learn that a model that is such and such size or like yay big, then we're going to need to, then you're going to need to put in place such and such requirements on it, or you're going to need to do like such and such checks, or maybe you need to like bring in a red team or an audit or maybe like wait until you like maybe do like staged release or something like this. I think that is quite. I think that could be really promising. And then I think that there are like, especially if we end up living in some kind of world where something like the scaling hypothesis is true, or where like by just scaling up these models a lot, you might end up getting systems that are sort of at like human level. If that's true, then I think that this is a really promising direction, and I would love there to be more research on it and more people thinking about this. I think there are also some things we could do today to kind of start pushing in this direction that I like. So me and a colleague, Leonard Heim, we recently have done some engagement with the US government, where they are considering setting up this like national AI research resource, which is partly supposed to give compute to academic researchers to do work on AI. And then one thing that we said there was, okay, well, if you're going to be giving people a whole bunch of compute, could you put in this little principle that like with more power comes more responsibility. And so like if you train a model that is, a certain size, then you need to like take greater responsibility. Maybe you need to put it behind an API by default to make sure that like, so an API is basically when someone can, instead of like having the model on your like local computer or whatever, you just like, the model is like on the cloud or something like this. And then all I do is I just send it a prompt. I send it an input, and then I get back the output. And if that's the case, then that might be a useful way to make sure that like people can't misuse the model. Like if I can, like so with like GPT-3, for example, I can engage with an API, and then that means that like OpenAI can then have a filter that says, okay, well, it looks like Markus is producing a whole lot of content that like is about the war in Ukraine, and it seems like it's pro-Russia. And then
is this what you actually do? You just like send stuff about Ukraine to the GPT-3 API?
I mean, I have whenever I play with these algorithms or with these systems via API, I do try out like, can I make it say something bad, or do like produce a prompt that produce something that it's not supposed to produce? And yeah, quite often the answer I'll get back is like, oh no, we don't produce any image that has generated with the word Trump or whatever. And that kind of thing I think is very helpful, because it can then sort of create this layer that we can where we can sort of start putting in some sort of governance measures basically.
So you mentioned the neural scaling law. So basically that you could just like get bigger models, throw more compute, and you get models that are increasingly better as measured by like accuracy or test laws, those kind of things people care about in machine learning. Another thing that recently came about is the chinchilla scaling law, where apparently you could just like have more data instead of having much bigger models. And in that case, private companies could be at an advantage, because they would have like a bunch of private data, like all the Gmail data or all the Facebook newsfeed. So do you think there's like anything to be done here in terms of like regulation? I know like in the EU, people have been regulating data with GDPR a lot. Do you think we could just like say like, hey, you cannot use your private data to train big models?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think like to be clear, so the chinchilla paper is just it's still saying that there's a scaling law. It's just that the ratio between the different things, so the ratio between the amount of compute and the like size of the model and the amount of data just turned out like the claim is that the ratio is different than we thought, and data matters more than we thought. Yeah, I think that's right. Compute, like data will probably matter a lot. I think maybe a thing that will end up happening more over time is that like people will pay more attention to like things like quality of data. Which currently it's kind of like not like a very legible thing, and so people just report like, oh, we use this much compute, or like our model is this big, and I think going forward people are going to like start focusing more on things like quality of data mattering, and if that's true, then this I think that might be really important. It could be the case that like that means that sort of an important moat, so like an important like barrier or like an important advantage that certain actors have, like so the big tech companies probably, or generally other companies that sort of can just get a whole bunch of relevant data. So maybe like via people engaging with their model, they might have a big advantage in producing better AI systems.
So we talk a lot about tech companies, and they're usually very good at like avoiding any regulation, paying taxes, all the things. Do you think there's like any chance that we can regulate any models from big tech companies?
Yeah, I think yes. I think to some. I mean, they're currently they're currently to some extent regulated, or like there's a bunch of laws that apply to any company operating in the world, and these companies try to make sure that they follow these laws. These companies try to make sure that they are compliant with GDPR. And if they're not, then they can get fines. I think. So I think yes, you should be able to like regulate these kinds of things. I think like maybe it's difficult to like make sure that compliance is high enough, or that enforcement is good enough. I think that's a problem, or like a sort of a challenge to work through. And then also, I mean, this is also already kind of happening. So maybe the biggest intervention that's happening here is the EU is producing this thing called the AI Act, where they are trying to sort of regulate certain uses of AI, and this might some of this regulation, I think, will sort of touch big tech companies.
How seriously do you think governments take AI safety?
Yeah, I think it depends on what one means by AI safety. If one means something like, oh, AI systems that we have today, they have a bunch of problems. They're not robust. They don't deal well with other distribution inputs. Sometimes they produce unfair results. Those things, or that kind of general description of AI systems, I think those memes or those views are like somewhat widespread. If you mean something like the number of, like, to what extent do like policymakers think that like it's like very plausible that AI systems at some point will be human level, and maybe this will even be in their lifetime, that number seems much lower. And if it's like policymakers doing a bunch to sort of, I guess, like take actions that like improve safety or something like this, while sort of paying a cost in like how well their AI industry does, then I think that's much less the case. Like most policymakers that I'm aware of, or that I end up talking to, like the main thing that they're thinking about, at least in the US and in the UK, most policymakers, the sort of the main thing that they're thinking about is like, how can we support our AI industry in our country? AI is going to produce a whole bunch of economic value. We want to seize that. We want to sort of be at the frontier of this technology. And then people are starting to see like, oh no, it turns out that like if we just deploy these systems in a bunch of different contexts, they're going to cause problems. And I think that there is like a general awareness, for example, that like, oh, maybe like recommender systems used on social media have caused some problems and might continue to cause harm. And so like, yeah, especially in the EU, I think the policymaker view is a little bit different, where that's much more like, oh, these systems are a bit scary and they're like causing harm right now, and we're going to try to figure out how to do something about it.
Yeah, the EU is one of the leading actors in regulating AI. And you used to work in Oxford at GovAI there. You still work for GovAI, but maybe remotely. Mm-hmm. And I think most people are not familiar with what GovAI does. I thought GovAI Center for the Governance of AI.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So yeah, what does GovAI stand for? What do you do there?
Yeah, so it stands for the Center for the Governance of AI. We are a sort of nonprofit research institution. We used to be a part of something called the Future of Humanity Institute, which was a part of, or is a part of, the University of Oxford. And then we spun out about a year ago. And I guess one way that we usually describe our work is that we are trying to sort of build a field of people who are trying to figure out how humanity can manage the transition towards a world of advanced AI systems. So AI systems that are much more capable than the ones we have today, and figuring out how we can make sure that sort of humanity or sort of a society can thrive, in a world with those kinds of technologies.
Now your title is head of AI policy and maybe other things. So I recall you're doing like some kind of team building. You're creating a new team, hiring people. What kind of team are you setting up there?
The thing that I'm currently doing is setting up what we call a policy team. What does policy mean?
What is policy?
You might ask. So basically the purpose of the team is something like, we want to do sort of AI policy development with a focus on more advanced AI systems. So basically the thing that we're trying to do is we're trying to sort of answer the question, what do we want powerful actors today in the AI space? So like governments, but also AI labs. Those are like the main actors that we're thinking about. What do we want? What should they do over the next handful of years to prepare for a world with these more advanced systems? And sort of our goal is to just do very rigorous, hopefully very good and very sensible research on those questions, and maybe produce some recommendations of what would be good to do. And then we're gonna tell people about it. We'll do a little bit of sort of direct advocacy of sort of engaging with policymakers ourselves. But for the most part, I'm excited about us just trying to directly answer some of these questions, and then hopefully we can, hopefully some of the work can speak for itself, or we can talk to other people whose main job is to sort of do advocacy or whatever. And so yeah, mainly trying to fill that part of the pipeline.
So you mentioned advocacy, doing some work, some outputs where people can look at it. Mm-hmm. What kind of good regulation do you think people will look over? What kind of regulation looks good according to your team?
So I think one thing to note is we try to not have we don't have like a party line. We don't have like a view of the organization. Maybe we have like some things that we like that people agree on or something like this. But for the most part, we're individuals that are thinking about similar issues, and we sort of we challenge each other and we try to figure out what the truth is or what the right answer is, and then we, you know, for the most part, people publish things under their own name and that kind of thing. So I think one shouldn't think that like anything that I say like represents GovAI as an organization.
If people are curious and want to like apply to work for that, they might just want to know like what kind of work people do usually and what they're interested in.
Yeah.
I know you. So I visited at some point GovAI a little bit when I was in Oxford, and it was part of the Future of Medicine Institute, as you mentioned. Who cares about the future of humanity? And you know, AI that can be transformative or even, you know, become AGI sooner than most people expect. So are there like any kind of bets, like AI regulation bets that you are making that are like not on, you know, regulating self-driving cars now, but mostly like regulating like transformative AI system?
The way that I expect our work to go is like we do some work to try to sort of map the whole space and figure out like, oh, maybe we want, you know, governments to do this. And then we spend a bunch of time figuring out whether that's the case. But I think most of our time will be on this sort of figuring out whether that's the case bit. So like following a small number of bets. What are those bets?
What are those bets, Markus?
Michael might be asking. Some of the ones that seem likely, one is sort of a thing that we talked about a little bit before that we call sort of like compute governance. So the question is something like, if we think that sort of compute is going to be a particularly important proxy of sort of very capable systems, and if we think that that's sort of otherwise a very useful sort of governance node, so sort of a lever that you can use to govern these systems or sort of do AI governance work or sort of make sure that these systems are sort of not causing harm and sort of being used for good things, then how can we use this lever? So we're going to do a bunch of work with that. So one of my colleagues, Leonard Heim, he'll be the main person working on that, and we'll sort of work together on it. Some of the kinds of things to explore there include this thing that we talked about earlier of sort of, could we make it the case that there are sort of maybe like levels or something like this of what amount of compute comes with what amount of responsibility. I think that's a really promising one, and there's a bunch of ways in which you could try to make that happen. And there's a bunch of details to think through. I think that's a big one. Another bet is one that another colleague will be working a lot on. His name is Jonas Schuett, and he will be primarily working on questions of sort of corporate governance. So like what internal policies, what internal sort of organizational structures should companies set up to make sure that they are sort of accurately managing and sort of seeing and doing something about various risks that might appear from the systems that they develop, and then trying to sort of develop a bank of knowledge on that, and then trying to inform these companies about it, maybe also informing what policymaking should look like. So, for example, in the forthcoming EU AI Act, most likely it's going to be the case that there are going to be requirements for sort of high-risk systems to have like post-deployment sort of checks to see like, oh, is my system, I thought my system was fine, I'm going to keep checking whether that's the case. And then you're going to have to do sort of risk management processes to sort of make sure that they kind of discover ways in which their systems might be sort of infringing on human rights or something like this.
So high risk is basically when your system can infringe on human right.
I don't remember the exact definition. I think it's that and like maybe threat to like human life and health or something like this. But it's also systems that like do this in kind of like an acute way or something like this. So it's like you need to be able to point to a person and say like, oh, you were harmed by this system. And so the EU AI Act, it's probably not going to cover things like recommender systems that sort of maybe they have a really big effect, but it's diffused. It's sort of it applies a little bit to lots of little people or lots of big people as well.
It's mostly for like self-driving cars killing someone, maybe. So
the EU AI Act will probably not cover self-driving cars. I think there will be separate regulation for that. I don't actually remember. And then, but yeah, it'll be on things like hiring algorithms, for example. You're like, okay, well, there's a person here who might be harmed if this algorithm is wrong, or if this algorithm does something badly. It will also apply to things like sort of biometric surveillance, so like cameras that like are used for facial recognition and that kind of thing. It also bans some things.
For hiring, it seems like humans make a bunch of harmful decisions every day. Why are we regulating AI?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think it's a question that, like, when you think about how to regulate AI, it needs answers. What are some of the reasons that, like, you might expect there to be a difference? One reason is, like, that AI systems will, like, they might be causing errors in different ways from humans. Like, we have regulation today that is about how you're allowed to do hiring. I don't know what the exact laws are, but I imagine that there's a bunch of ways in which I could make hiring decisions that would be illegal.
Like hiring only white males from Sweden.
Probably, yeah, exactly, yeah. Who would do that? That might be illegal, or at least, like, if I'm hiring them because they are white males from Sweden, and maybe I say that explicitly to one of them, or to some people who, like, didn't get the job, I imagine that would be illegal. And so you might think, like, oh, well, why don't we just apply the existing laws to AI systems? That's something that, like, some jurisdictions are doing. So this is kind of what's happening in the US, and maybe is what will end up happening in the UK as well, where you take more of that kind of approach. I think that, like, there are, like, plausible arguments that, like, you might want something different in the AI case. And here are some reasons. One reason might be that, like, these systems, you might expect people to use these systems more than is warranted. So people are like, this is a new technology. And so people are going to find it really difficult to know how they work, and, like, in what situations they might fail and cause harm. If that's the case, then, like, having regulation in place that makes it the case that people need to take more precaution than they would otherwise might be really good. You might also think that, like, some of these systems might cause problems via, like, it, like, creates more correlated decisions. So if I'm a big company and I'm hiring people, there's a lot of different hiring committees with a lot of different people on it. And so there will be some noise around the right answer. And so, like, quite often there will be people who deserve the job or should have gotten the job, but they didn't get the job. But all those errors are uncorrelated. And so it's not the case that, like, one group of people are systematically discriminated against. And I think that might be that's one reason to worry about that's less the case in this situation. Whereas in the AI case, like, if I have one model and that model continues to fail in a particular way, then there'll be, like, one person or one group of people who will be disadvantaged. And that seems like that's more sort of unjust or more problematic. There's another one. Can I do the third one?
Go ahead.
Another one that I think is interesting is, like, going forward, at least as like some of these models become more interpretable, but maybe even today, like, we can actually test some of these things. We can actually, like, see whether the model is, like, making a decision based on whether people are, like, white male Swedish people. And so if that's the case, then that's, like, that allows us to actually do something about this discrimination that maybe we couldn't have done previously, because we could, like, today we could take these systems and we could just try to run an experiment. Like, I send the same CV, but I change the name to something, white male Swedish sounding like, and then I see whether that is making a difference. And that's quite easy, because I could just send that input to the system right away. And then maybe in the future, we might move towards, like, the sort of these fairness requirements on these systems. Maybe they're more about, like, whether a system is making a decision based on a certain thing, and so you could just try to make it more the case that your model is more interpretable. And so you can actually literally see, hopefully in the future, whether a certain attribute, whether a certain feature of the person is being a part of making this decision. So there's some sense in which, like, as our ability to sort of identify and do something about a certain harm increases, then our duties to actually use that ability increases, where maybe we couldn't do that today. And so, with great power comes great responsibility.
Uncle Ben. So the thing about testing interpretability or testing the bias, systematic bias, is something that might happen if they give us, their private API, and we can just, like, test the model by ourselves. We can just, like, throw outputs, and we can do this, like, auditing or consulting on those things. But right now, I'm not sure if you can actually do it. If you can actually, like, send a bunch of CVs to people. Imagine there's, like, a company doing, like, a systematic bias. Like, I'm not really allowed to, like, send 1,000 CVs to a system.
I mean, I don't actually know whether people are doing this. I mean, I know there is research on this kind of thing that involves human hiring decisions, where there are all these studies where you send out a CV and you change the name to something that sounds like it's sort of not of the minority or the majority group in the country, and then you see what happens. And there's a bunch of these studies. I assume that they do this without the company knowing, and so maybe you could do this today as well, and that like maybe you could sort of. You could figure out what companies are using certain kind of software, and then you could like start sending out these things. I hope people are doing that. That would be awesome. And if they're not, then you could do it. Exactly. And then I guess in the future, I would want that to be done more like sort of more systematically, or it's like there are like requirements to do this kind of thing, or sort of these companies feel compelled to do a lot of this kind of testing. I don't know the extent to which they're doing it today. Maybe they're doing it to a large extent, but I would imagine that it'd be exciting if they did more and like brought in outsiders to like help figure that stuff out.
So what I meant is just like requiring some like regulation where companies need to like provide an API so people can like test. And imagine there's like some restrictions on how like interpretable your models need to be. You need to have like an API so people like can test the model and see if it's really interpretable or not biased. Yep. So you talked about stuff you're excited about, but what are the things that GovAI has produced, like concrete like outputs, reports, decision makers?
So one question you might have, or that like this is like that's like attached to this, is something like what good have we done? Have we done anything useful for the world? I guess my view is like the most useful stuff we've done for the world is like we've like helped build a field basically of people trying to think about these questions. And then maybe and then like part of that is like there are like people who have worked with us who now do things that I'm excited about, and they're out there in the world and they're hopefully doing good things. That's my guess is that that's most of the value that we've produced to date. In terms of like things that you can see. I mean, you can see these humans, but it's sort of difficult to sort of evaluate, how they've done, and maybe they don't have time to talk to you. So we published a decent amount of research over in the past. Most of that research has looked sort of a little bit more sort of academic, and it's sort of a little bit more sort of like sort of fits into the sort of political science end of things, or sort of international relations. Published in sort of various journals or whatnot. You can find a bunch of these things on our website. I think we're sort of over time, at least like the kind of work that I'm likely to do more in the future and am excited about happening more is a little bit more like sort of, it doesn't look like academic publications, because maybe most of it is like, hey, X, Google, or hey, someone, you should do this. Here's why. And that doesn't look like an academic paper. But I would expect us to do more of that in the future.
And so this is mostly like you writing a Google Docs and sending it to Google.
Yeah, or maybe first you write a Google Doc, and then you ask for a bunch of feedback from people and you discuss it. Maybe you do a workshop around it, and then you turn that into a document that you like publish on our website or something like this, and then you send it to a bunch of relevant people, depending on what the piece is. Maybe we do a bunch of outreach about it. Maybe we like send it to journalists, or maybe we try to tell people about it a bit more. But yeah, I think the kind of output will depend a lot on what we're trying to do. At the moment, we're in the process of publishing. When this comes out, I think we'll have published a big report that we wrote about the extent to which the EU's AI Act is going to sort of see regulatory diffusion, so like whether it will affect other jurisdictions or like companies in other jurisdictions. And when we publish that, we'll be sending it around to a bunch of people and hopefully get journalists excited about it and get policymakers excited about it. And then I think there's some other outputs that we've done to date and we'll continue to do, which looks a little bit more like we're working directly with some actor that is trying to make some decisions. So like me and Jonas Schutt, we spent a little bit of time sort of on loan to a part of the Cabinet Office, helping them think about like what UK AI regulation should look like. And yeah, those things we can't really share outside of government because it was we wrote these things for the Cabinet Office. And I think there will be, we'll continue to do that kind of thing if the opportunities look interesting and look like we could do something useful.
Yeah, look awesome. I hope more people work on those things. And the good thing is that you're hiring more people.
Yes,
so if you want more people to join your company, what would be like the pitch? And also like, what kind of profile do you think would be interesting?
That's a great question. Yeah, I probably should have said that at the start when you asked what team I'm building. Yeah, so we're currently at this very moment where we are sort of in the process of sort of going through. We closed applications for like research scholars to our to GovAI as a whole, but also to this policy team. So this is people who will be sort of working with us for at least for a year, and then maybe we'll extend them if things seem to work out. And sort of in a few months, we'll probably open a position for like research fellows. So these are people who will be sort of staying with the organization for a bit longer. And I think in general, I expect us to continue to want to hire people and have enough funding to sort of keep people on if sort of exciting work is coming out. Who do we want, or like what kind of people are we looking for?
So what's a good criteria? Like if I'm watching this video, what's like a good like check I can do on myself?
So if we specifically talk about this policy team, what are some things that I'm looking for? I'm looking for people who
white Swedish male.
No. That would be maybe I don't know. Maybe you would even like, because it would be so awkward if I hired another, like I'm the only white Swedish male in my team. But if I hired another one, it would be really awkward. And so maybe you're even going to get a disadvantage. I don't really know. Don't sue me. I would expect like an example of things that I look for. One thing I look for is just people who are part of the reason I'm doing this work is because I'm a little bit annoyed. Like I have been in conversations with sort of policymakers, or people who are like supposed to be making decisions or could potentially make important decisions. And I feel like I just like don't have good enough things to say, or like I have some things to say, but I feel like they're not well evidenced enough, or like there has been no one who has spent months or years thinking about this question. And I'm like, that seems terrible. And we should definitely do that. And so that's one of the reasons for that, like sort of motivated me emotionally to sort of start doing this kind of work. And I think having that annoyance is probably quite helpful, or having that sort of that view of sort of this is important seems helpful. Other things that sort of I think we will look for are like people who are sort of who write and think pretty clearly, or sort of can sort of write well and can sort of like be good at like structuring a problem and breaking it down. People have some kind of relevant expertise, but in our case, that's kind of we have a reasonably broad view of what relevant expertise might be. But as long as it's like clear how it might connect to a bet that we're planning on pursuing, or a bet that we are sort of might be excited to pursue. And so that might be like, you know, you've done a relevant PhD, or you've done sort of like, you've worked a bit in policy, or maybe you've sort of worked at a tech company in sort of a policy or like a governance style role. All of those things seem super relevant. I think another thing that I'm looking for, which I'm a little bit less sure whether this is a good description, but I think maybe is something like in a lot of this like AI policy stuff, your job is to take, there's this whole sea of considerations. There's a whole bunch of different ideas or different things that might sort of pull you in different directions of like, your question is like, is it good to do X? You know, I don't know. Should we, to what extent should we, should the EU AI Act, I don't know, regulate general purpose AI systems, for example, like AI systems that can be used in a whole bunch of different domains, foundation models or something like this. There's a whole bunch of considerations that will pull in different directions and might make it like a good or a bad decision, or sort of specific details that it might be this way or that. That decision depends on like a whole bunch of different variables that you have to sort of figure out how to sort of integrate in some way. And one thing that I think seems kind of plausible is like a person who can do that well is a person who could do like judgmental forecasting well. So someone who can take like a question like, I don't know, will Putin remain is he the president of Russia? I guess he's the president of Russia.
I hope it is.
Oh, okay.
No, I mean, I hope it is. Otherwise, it would be weird for him to like take all those decisions.
Yeah, that's true. So to what extent, will he be, like, what's the chance that he will be the president of Russia in 2025? That kind of question is one where that kind of has the same type of feature, I think. And so people who can do that well might be people who would be suitable for this kind of work. For GovAI in general, maybe take all the things I previously said, but we're also excited about like more like different kinds of research. Maybe research that like focuses less on like, okay, I'm trying to figure out what actions people should take over the next few years. And maybe it's a little bit more like to date, a lot of our research has looked at like, I kind of describe it as like, it's like mapping the strategic landscape or something like this. And so you're like, okay, well, I think that for the development of AI, this particular dynamic or this particular part of the ecosystem is going to be very important. And so you might be like, oh, probably the like US-China interactions on AI is going to be important. And so having people think about what's going on in China on AI seems great. And then maybe another example is like we have had some people doing sort of forecasting work, or we have someone who does sort of Noemi Jaxler. She does sort of surveys of sort of populations whose opinions about AI might matter to how AI goes. And so maybe like ML researchers or the public or economists or like policymakers. And so that's another style of work that we're also excited about as well.
So making good forecasts about what will happen in 2025, making good AI strategy mapping of like what would be the relevant actors and considerations. Sometimes by doing some surveys of important people like ML researchers, economists, being really annoyed at how little people know about AI policy in the AI policy space, and being willing to put in some effort or like have some like 1 or 2 years experience in the field. So all those things are important. I hope you get a bunch of application. So more generally, to move on from your work and just talk about like AI policies in general, are you like bullish on AI policy? Do you think there's like been a bunch of progress in AI policy recently?
Going back, I realized a thing that I'm also supposed to do probably is to say, if you want to know more, then you go to governance.ai, which is our website.
GOVER. I'm too tired to do this, but yeah, governance.ai.
Yeah. Am I bullish on AI policy progress? I don't really know. There's a bunch of it depends a lot on like how you split up this space or something like this. In general in the world, like there's a ton of increased attention to AI and sort of how AI is impacting society, and people trying to figure out like, oh, should we regulate this technology? How should we do that? Oh, maybe like social media companies are causing harm via their AI algorithms. What do we do about that? This seems like a good development to me, and I want society to be thinking more about these problems. Partly because I think that these present day problems have some analogy to like the problems that you'll face with sort of more capable systems in the future, or at the very least like it's like this is some kind of like practice run, or maybe it's like we start building the institutions or building the sort of capabilities that we'll need to be able to deal with these technologies in the future. That seems like a good development. Has there been enough? I don't know. It'd be great for there to be more.
Who else is doing work except from GovAI?
I mean, a lot of people. I think
like the main actors in this space.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on. Yeah, so if the space is just like people who are doing work on what do we want, how is AI impacting society and what can we do about that more broadly, there's a ton of organizations and you should be able to find them. If the focus is more on like organizations that see themselves as like, our job is to try to think about what advanced AI capabilities, like how to govern those. That's a smaller number, a significantly smaller number. Some organizations that I'd recommend people look into are
CSET maybe in the US.
Yeah, I think they're a good organization.
Center for Security and of Emerging Technologies.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Security and Emerging Technologies. So they're an organization in DC. They're a think tank. I think what like distinguishes them is they're sort of a particularly sort of they're very sort of data driven and like care a lot about evidence. Like when you compare to other think tanks in DC, my impression is that they're much more sort of rigorous, and they sort of they try to make sure that they they have like data, they produce data that nobody else has or whatever on a lot of these questions. And then some of the work that they do touches on like more advanced AI capabilities. Most of it is to do with like what do we want the U.S. government to do today. I think that's a relevant organization. Rethink Priorities is another organization that is sort of starting to build a team that thinks about some of these questions. I'd recommend people check out that.
I've interviewed Peter Wilford on the
podcast.
Oh,
nice, great, yeah. So I think that's great. I think there's a bunch of organizations where like you can kind of do this work, but it's not like the main thing of the organization, like. Center for the Study of Existential Risk in the US or in the UK. And then there's sort of a bunch of organizations here in the Bay who sort of where you could do this kind of work, but it's not their main thing. You can do this kind of work at a lot of or at least a reasonable number of sort of AI labs or AI companies have teams that do relevant work. And so there are sort of governance teams at OpenAI, at DeepMind, there are relevant teams at Anthropic. Sort of these big tech companies, they have relevant teams, but they're mainly thinking about like, okay, we're going to deploy a product. How do we make sure that that product doesn't, harm people or, do something that is going to be really embarrassing and is going to be used as an example of how AI systems can cause harm over, years to come.
At OpenAI, they had this like charter 2 or 3 years ago, or maybe even 4, right?
So the charter?
Yeah, the charter,
like the charter of like I don't know how long ago they were started, but yeah, kind of at the start.
I think when they created OpenAI LP,
right,
like for-profit status. Yeah, I'm confused about the.
I think the charter was before that.
Yeah, but actually, like they had this kind of useful output on like what would happen with very strong systems. I think that's like one of the kind of main outputs from AI governance teams. Not the main one, but like I guess like one of the outputs I know of that like mentions AGI explicitly.
For the most part, the sort of work that looks like sort of actions that are taken today, or work that looks like, oh, hey, actor such and such, can you please do X? Or like, someone that's inside of a lab saying, can you do this and that? Most of that doesn't explicitly like talk about like AGI or whatever. My guess is that that's good. My guess is that like we want that like for the most part the sort of the thing that you should do instead is more like, okay, well, here's something that like looks like it makes sense and is very helpful in terms of like preparing us for more advanced systems that also makes sense today. For example, if you're trying to affect what like sort of AI labs, what they're doing, I think a lot of the things that you want to do today looks like you figure out, you find cases where sort of you're dealing with a present day problem or a problem that like these companies will sort of start feeling soon, and that like ways in which these AI systems might be causing harm now, and then you try to figure out how to solve that problem while also preparing the company and preparing the world for more advanced systems. Part of the reason for that is like you'll just have a larger coalition of actors and sort of people within the company and people outside of the company who will be sort of excited and interested in helping out. And I think that's just going to be quite that's like a lot of the times it's going to be like the really useful thing to do. Also just because like people's credences on the extent to which we'll like have human level machine intelligence or whatever, they differ widely, and so it's going to be difficult to like a lot of the times it's going to be difficult to push things through if the only reason is like, oh, this will only be helpful if it's the case that we in the next 20 years or whatever develop these like very, very powerful systems. And so I think in general you want to be thinking about things that are sort of that sort of makes sense from multiple perspectives, or is sort of robust to worldviews. So you can do this work at AI labs, and then you can do it at some of these sort of like research institutions. I think another thing that you can do is you can do some of this work, like some of this policy work. You can also do at go into government or go into organizations that you think are going to be making important decisions and sort of like learn about those and sort of understand what's happening there and see if you can be helpful, or sort of if there are certain perspectives that they need to hear more about. And then another thing you can do is you can work for organizations that try to discuss or sort of try to like do advocacy or sort of engage with policymakers more, who like see that as their main job. And there's sort of I don't know if there's a ton of those, but there's more of those than there are organizations that are sort of doing this like AI policy development research. Examples of organizations that you might look into include like Future of Life Institute are probably, maybe when this comes out, probably hiring for some of these kinds of roles. The Future Society also might be hiring for these kinds of things. There's a bunch of think tanks where you can do that as well. I'm probably forgetting some organization, but I don't know. What they might be. Maybe another organization in the UK that I'm excited about is called the Center for Long-Term Resilience. They have a bunch of people as well.
What kind of actors are you looking at? Do you like just look at Google, Alphabet, Tencent, maybe DeepMind, and OpenAI, those kind of things? You look at like the people who are at the frontier of AI research?
In terms of the work that we will end up doing, or that I'm like most excited about doing, that will probably look like try to focus on the actors whose decisions we think matter the most. And so yeah, those would be included. Also various governments. I feel a bit unsure about like the extent to which I think that like, I don't know, international governmental organizations like the OECD or like the UN are going to be like making important decisions about these topics. Maybe that's the case, or at the very least, I think that they might be important in like creating some kind of like global consensus about like what kinds of problems we're going to face with these technologies. I think another sort of space that might end up being important if this sort of whole compute governance thing is true, then sort of semiconductor companies or sort of chip manufacturing companies or chip design companies might also matter a lot.
How do you talk to them? Just like, please stop producing chips.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you get a fine.
I mean, yeah, I don't know if I would say that to them. But I think you, yeah, I mean, so it depends a little bit on the context. Most of the time, like I would be, like me personally, I would be engaging with organizations or engaging with people where like some combination of like, I already know people there, or like there's some kind of connection, or like maybe they know or I know that like I have something that can be helpful to them or that like is useful to them. And then sometimes that looks like sort of you work on a research project or you work on a certain question, and then you produce some useful documents, and then you share it with these people, and then like they're like in that way you kind of start building up like connections and networks, etc. But I think yeah, in general, having like starting to like build up a network for these kind of things is like a very, very helpful thing to sort of figure out how to do this work well. Because a lot of the times there's just a bunch of context that you'll lack if you don't like sort of know people, or if you aren't able to sort of get a little bit of an inside scoop on some of these questions.
So you just like start building trust and relationships that might like matter in the long term.
And also just like getting to know people who have something like where I think in general, the way that like oftentimes this happens or ends up being useful is like you both have something to offer each other. And so like maybe if I'm talking to, it depends on who, but like maybe it's like some policymakers, if I'm talking to them, maybe like a thing that I can offer them is like, oh, I've thought about how like AI might impact the world in a bunch of different ways. And then I can like offer them some thoughts, and then maybe they find that interesting or find that helpful in like how to think about AI. So I'm offering them that, and then like sort of in turn, they're offering me some kind of like an image or like an understanding of how they think about these problems and sort of the kinds of issues that they think are important, and like they think like might the sort of decisions that they might be making in the future or whatever. And then yeah, I think like in general, that's the kind of relationship that you have to build. And so like one useful way to do that is you do like if you're an outsider like me, the way that you do it is like you try to produce knowledge or produce something that is like of use to people or whatever. And so you like try to answer an important question for these actors, and then you chat to them about it. And that's like sort of the way to start like building it and start sort of like learning more things as well.
So a positive sum game where you just like cooperate and exchange information about like what the future of AI will look like. Do you try to focus on things they understand, like don't mention or AGI, and just like talk about advanced machine learning systems or big models?
Yeah.
Use their wording.
Yeah, I think that's a thing that you want to do in general. Like if you're, so I don't have like, in general, I don't have like super. In general, I have like pretty wide credences on most things, so I'm not like super confident in any particular view that I like want to push. But I think even if that's the thing that you're trying to do, then like the way to engage in these kinds of conversations is that you like try to understand what the other person is thinking and what their worldview looks like, and you engage with that. And so like whenever you can, maybe you use the particular language that they're using or whatever. I think that's like super helpful, and you need to like sort of serve this like translation type function. And then I think another thing that you want to do, or like in general, like sometimes a thing that people think about or ask about is like, oh, should I tell like policymakers that AI systems are going to be like human level within X number of years, and then I guess I'm of the view that like I guess like my views aren't like, oh, this will happen super soon, and so like you got to warn everyone. But I think even if it were the case that these like that you would have like some super capable systems very soon. I don't think it's clear what you should do with that. It could be the case that you don't want to, like, there's this, if the thing that you want to do is you want to communicate like, oh, these technologies might be really important. They might also cause a bunch of harm. And so we should do things to like avoid that harm. If you say that and then people only take away the first belief, where they're like, oh, this technology is going to be really powerful, or it's going to be really economically important, or something like this, then they're going to go and do like the opposite of what you wanted them to do. Then they're going to go and be like, okay, I'm going to like try to make sure that I'm at the forefront of this technology, and sort of push it ahead. And so I think there's like, it's sort of a fraught issue of like, if you hold this belief that like, yeah, these systems are going to be like very, like they're going to be like super useful or whatever, they're going to like be really capable, and they might be dangerous, then like communicating that is kind of fraught or kind of difficult to like make sure that you communicate both things together. And so I think like, for the most part, my view is like, at least it's like more robustly useful, or like more robustly a thing that you should do of like talking about the second thing, where you're like, oh, you know, people are trying to deploy these systems today and they're just like failing in all of these different ways, and like things might go wrong in lots of ways that like it's difficult to for you to anticipate.
So you talk more about the risk and about why the systems might fail, instead of talking about how those systems might be very capable in the future, because otherwise you can like accelerate race dynamics. Concrete case study. Imagine you're talking to the EU about how to do a certain decision about self-driving cars. How do you shape that decision? How do you like talk to them about like what to do for the self-driving car? How to make it more interpretable and those things? Like, do you can you even like talk to them about this, or is it like mostly something that happens like inside of Brussels or the UK government?
I personally haven't engaged that much with conversations around self-driving cars. I'd be interested to know how the extent to which we think that, like the extent to which it's the case that present day regulation on self-driving cars is going to be important for more impactful systems in the future. I guess my bet is that other regulation or like regulatory action is going to matter more. If I were to talk to someone about self-driving cars, what are some of the things that I would say? I would probably, I mean, for the most part, I think like I would probably like talk about things that like just seem like good legislation or whatever, or like good regulation. So like, okay, we what are some examples of this? Like one thing that I like care a lot about is it the case that these self-driving cars are like mean that there are fewer or more road deaths than there are currently? If there are fewer road deaths than there are currently, if you were to deploy these systems into the streets, okay, that seems like a strong argument in favor of doing so. And then probably you would start like you would want to have like a bunch of regulation or a bunch of rules to make sure that like you find ways in which these systems continue like might fail, or ways that they might have sort of correlated failure, for example, like this. Making sure that that's the case seems really important. Making sure that these organizations or sort of that there's sort of a regulatory system that might sort of identify these problems and do something about them seems really important. You mentioned interpretability. I think in general, I'm in favor of figuring out ways to make sure that AI models are more interpretable, just because like that seems important for much more capable systems. For self-driving cars in particular, if we're just like, you're imagining that like, you know, you have systems, a self-driving car today, and then like the only thing that I'm trying to do is I'm trying to regulate self-driving cars like going into the future. I don't know how much interpretability matters. Like in the self-driving car case, the thing that I care about is like, are people dying as a result of this car or not? It's like maybe one of the main things I care about. And then like to do that, maybe I don't need that much interpretability. Maybe the main thing I need is I just need to know like, I just need to have good stats on what's happening, and sort of good stats on sort of when the system is failing, and making sure that you do something about that.
But maybe the general public might want to, you know, have some strong reasons to think something is safe before deploying it. So before making it legal for like everyone to drive a self-driving Uber car, maybe they want to like know how the thing works and not be a black box.
Yeah. So I think that could be the case. There might be other arguments that I don't know how strong they would be, but yeah, you could maybe make an argument that like, oh well, we're not going to be able to make any insurance claims or whatever, or like decide who is liable or who's at fault if there's an accident, unless these systems are more interpretable than they are today. I can imagine that those kinds of arguments like make a lot of sense, and in which case maybe you should have a push towards this kind of thing. And yeah, I don't know what the public's reaction will be to these kind of things. Maybe people will react in that kind of way, and in that case, maybe we do need to have like stronger interpretability requirements. And in which case, I would be excited about that if that were true, because that would then mean that like this sort of car industry or whatever, or this like self-driving car industry would have to invest in a bunch of research that would be helpful to how to govern AI in a bunch of other domains.
I don't know about the general public, but I know that Jan LeCun on Twitter kind of complained about this new rule. I think, is it a EU rule of, self-driving cars must be that level interpretable to be deployed?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, this kind of brings us to the general space of, EU regulations. And I think this is something you're kind of familiar with. If you talk, the UK is not part of the EU, but maybe you do work more closely with the EU. So you talk about the EU AI Act. Mm-hmm. How much regulation is there right now in the EU AI space?
Yeah, first there's just a point that like, well, AI systems are currently regulated in the sense that like anything is regulated. And so yeah, if I were to deploy an AI system in my company, then that I need to continue to obey the laws that I'm currently continuing to obey. There's like, I think in my mind there's maybe like three important developments in the EU. Maybe there's about three. So one is there's this cluster of things that recently were adopted that will come into force. I don't quite know when, but fairly soon. So there's a package of a thing called the Digital Markets Act and then the Digital Services Act. These are particularly focused on like big tech companies. They call them gatekeeper companies or like platforms or whatever. And the Digital Services Act does things like you need to tell people what your algorithms are doing. So like on Facebook or whatever would need to give certain be slightly more transparent on what their recommender algorithm is doing. And those kinds of things. The Digital Markets Act is a little bit more about like mergers and acquisitions and that kind of thing. I think both of those things will have really big impacts on the AI industry. They might even have it globally as well. Like for example, if the Digital Services Act requires certain changes to your AI systems or sort of like to Facebook's recommender algorithm, then maybe that would be deployed abroad. Then there's sort of some changes are being made to sort of the EU liability directive. So this is about these things of like, if something goes wrong with a product, who is held responsible, who needs to pay for the mistake. And then the third thing that I've been focusing most on is this question of is this AI Act that does kind of what I mentioned in the past. So it does it bans certain uses of AI. And so, for example, it says like AI systems used to produce social credit scores, for example.
Like what's happening in China right now.
Yeah. Or there's some social credit score style things happening in China. That's a thing that they ban. They ban certain kinds of facial recognition stuff, and then they ban like systems that manipulate people. Or maybe that like manipulates vulnerable groups to take actions that that is like harmful to them or to others. And then they have this other category that maybe is the most important thing is they have this category of like high risk systems. So these are these systems that like might cause some harm to fundamental rights or human health or human well-being in some sense to a specific person. They also have another category of like limited risk systems. And so these are systems that like where the only thing that you need to do is like you need to tell people that the system is active or whatever. And so, for example, this applies to like AI generated content. So the claim will be like, or the law will say something like, if you produce an image using a like image generation system like DALL-E or Midjourney or something like this, that you can't just like show that to people without it being tagged as generated by an AI system. And so like if I have a profile picture that's like a deep fake, then that profile picture, the law would require there to be some note somewhere telling the viewer that this is a deep fake.
This is very hard to implement.
Seems very hard to implement. I don't know how it will happen in practice. Maybe it'll be the kind of thing that like the platforms end up helping implement, but I'm not really sure. And then there's this high risk category. And I think that one seems like that one seems really important. And so then like in cases that like AI systems that fall into this category, basically they have a long list of requirements that you need to fulfill, basically, and to meet those.
Is the basic idea that if the EU makes a bunch of regulations, then tech companies will need to like comply to those regulations, and they will end up like building like one product that complies with the EU laws? And so this is like one path for like why those like regulation in the EU might be useful.
Yeah. So this is this report that I was mentioning on the extent to which we'll see regulatory diffusion from the EU. So there's this thing that people call like the Brussels effect, which is like the thought is that sometimes the EU regulates things. In particular, they regulate products. So they're like, okay, well, you can only sell your thingamajig in the EU if you fulfill these requirements. And then the developer or the sort of producer of this thingamajig, they have to rejig their whole factory to produce a thingamajig in a EU compliant way. And then once they've done that, they're like, oh God, okay, well, I guess either we could create a new factory that does this, and we sell the sort of non-EU compliant thingamajig outside of the EU and the compliant one inside of the EU, or we could just sell the EU compliant one globally. And then this is a thing that has happened in a bunch of different cases in the EU, and the question is whether we'll see this with the EU. So this effect that I just talked about, this is called like a de facto diffusion. So like in fact, it diffuses, even though these companies don't have to comply. And then this other side of the coin is what people call de jure diffusion. So this is like other jurisdictions are inspired by the EU and pass EU-like regulation. So we wrote this big report about whether this will be the case for EU AI regulation. I think my overall take is like, probably to some extent. And I think it might end up being important. So I wrote this report with Charlotte Sigmund, who's currently at the Global Priorities Institute.
Is the report published already, or
it will be by the time this comes out? So it should be out in a few days. And then why would this end up happening? I think the thing that like the cases where I think this is going to be the most likely to happen or be the most impactful or important is if you have big tech companies. These big tech companies are sort of producing foundation models or producing models that are used in a whole bunch of different products, and they are offering them globally. And then if it's the case that some of these requirements require a retraining of that model for it to be slightly different or whatever, then my guess is that is going to be an important way in which you might get this de facto diffusion. So like they're just like okay. And then they retrain the model and making sure that it's EU compliant. But they've already paid all that cost, and maybe the model is even better because maybe the requirement is like your system is supposed to be sufficiently accurate or whatever, or the data needs to be of a certain quality. And then in that case, it will just make sense for them to deploy it globally. And then if you don't deploy it globally, then you'll have this issue where you will get like what we call sort of like duplication costs. And so like, imagine a lot of the cases when people think about sort of building technology, you talk about these tech stacks. And so you have like sort of a stack of different sort of different systems that you're building on top of each other. And then the claim is that like, if you change something like quite deep down in the tech stack and you sort of do a fork quite early on, then you have this whole thing after that to duplicate. And then that duplication is going to be really annoying because then you're going to need to have engineers that like understand two systems that are slightly different rather than just understanding one system. And then like if you change something like quite fundamental to the model, then like the changes sort of reverberate up through the entire system.
So if you fork the system into two things, then you have like more maintenance cost.
Exactly. That's the thought. And so in general, like software companies, for example, they strongly they try to make it the case that they have like one system that they can use globally, and then if they differentiate, then they they offer a slightly different product in different places. Then usually the way that they do that is they try to do it via like sort of changes to the sort of edge of the system, or like changes to the like very end of the system. And so, for example, in the EU AI Act, this requirement I was talking about of like you need to say if someone is interacting with a chatbot, you need to say you need to make people aware of that fact. So maybe the chatbot starts the conversation by saying, "Hello, I'm a chatbot. I am not a human. I am an AI system." And then in that case, like maybe it's super easy to just remove that little section of that little part of the system if you're deploying it outside of the EU. And so there might be those cases where you can just sort of change the filtering, or you can change the fine tuning, or something at the sort of the edge of the system or the top of the tech stack. In which case, I think we're much less likely to see this kind of diffusion.
Yeah, I've seen this everywhere. Like, oh, I'm a chatbot. Can I help you? Just to go back to the EU AI Act, I think one thing that has been happening on Twitter is people complaining about the definition of AI. So that basically AI could mean anything, could be like any like mathematical operation doing anything. Like, do you think they should have defined it better?
I think people exaggerate the extent to which that's a problem. So like, maybe this is gonna get too technical or too in the weeds. So like, how there's a great paper by my colleague Jonas Schuett about how to define AI in regulation. If you're really interested in this, you could have a look at that, and that says roughly the following. So like in the EU AI Act, and I think in regulation in general, the thing that you kind of want to do is ultimately the thing that you want to like have some way of identifying the systems that like you're going to impose some requirements on. In the EU AI Act, most of the work is not done by the term AI. Most of the work is done by other stuff. And so like what it says about AI is, it's this very, very broad definition. It does say that it's like, I don't quite remember the exact phrasing, but it says something along the lines of like, it's software that performs these kinds of operations or whatever. And then it says, or like that can, for example, perform these kinds of operations. But then most of the work of the definition, or most of the work of like setting the scope of the regulation, so like deciding what systems the regulation applies to, is just this list of high-risk systems, where it says like, okay, well, if you use an AI system, here's like a rough definition of what an AI system is in this context, then you're going to have to comply with these requirements. And so I think most of the work is being done there. And so like, I don't know, I've seen people say things like, oh, well, if I just like do Bayesian updating on a piece of paper, is that AI, or am I covered by the AI Act? And I don't think that that's the case.
People were very smart, very fun at parties. I think the EU AI Act also mentioned something about general purpose systems. Do you think they just like mean AGI, or just general systems in general?
This is like a point of contention currently in the discussion about the AI Act. So roughly the first suggestion was something like there's a high-risk AI system is a system that is used for one thing. If that's one thing that it is used for is a high-risk thing, then you need to comply with certain requirements. And then people might be like, oh, well, what about systems that can be used for multiple things? What happens in that case? And so then one thing that people, one point of contention is whether it should be the case that like these AI systems that are used for lots of different things. Some people, in particular, some like tech companies, put out things saying like, oh, we should have an exemption to this, and try to push for that. There's a part of during this process, there was like part of the presidency of the council. I think it was the Czech presidency. They put out a suggestion that like would sort of put an exemption for general purpose systems, and just put the sort of the duties or the responsibilities on the actor that like takes the system and applies it in a high risk context. Then recently there's been some contention about this, and so then there's the French presidency of the council. It kind of goes back and forth, and they kind of like fight it out a little bit. They made a suggestion where they said, oh no, it's going to be the case that we suggest that like general purpose systems, so systems that are used in a bunch of different contexts, they will also be they will also count as high risk, or they will count as, or maybe it's like a slightly different category, and they will need to meet certain requirements. And they won't need to meet all of the requirements, because that would be, some of the requirements are like really hard to meet if you aren't the person or aren't the actor deploying the model. But it's like a smaller subset of the things. And currently this is being debated back and forth a bunch, and over the next year or maybe 6 months or something like this, there's going to be some kind of decision about this question.
Is the idea that basically general models, like we talked about foundational models, will be constrained because they will be like applied in a bunch of different contexts, and in some contexts they will be like in high risk and have like a very bad outcome?
I guess the case, the deployer, like the company or the person who's like actually putting it into production and like making it interact with the real world or with people.
The company using let's say the OpenAI API for GPT-3 to like sell products with their API.
Yeah, exactly. And then I don't know what the right answer is. My guess is that like over time, my guess is that like maybe today it's not like my guess is like I would like there to be some requirements specifically for these general purpose systems. Probably you need to like figure out how to like carve that out or like how to get that scope right. But my guess is that like putting some responsibilities on those is going to be the right way to go. Partly because I expect that to be like important in the future or like important as these systems become like more and more capable, and especially if it's the case that like these systems become like a very central node of like a whole bunch of systems used all over the economy, then like they're gonna like if they fail in some way or if they're like cybersecurity isn't good enough, they're gonna like impose these externalities all over the economy that I think like might warrant having specific regulation of these particular systems or these particular actors. And then you'd have to figure out some way of dealing with like, oh well, if I'm just an academic and I'm just like publishing something on GitHub, then like I don't want to be like I shouldn't be liable for what someone does with my model. And I think you want to do something about that.
How much of like regulating the things with like EU AI Act or like other regulations is actually about like reducing existential risk from AI in the long term versus just like slowing everything down, so buying us like more time to develop safe systems?
In terms of when people are thinking about and like working on these things, like none of those things are what people have in mind, or they have in mind, oh, these systems are like causing problems today and then they're hurting people or whatever. What do we do about that? In terms of the actual, like, how I think about the value of these things, I'm not really sure. I think like most of the stuff that I spend time on is thinking about like how do we make sure that these regulatory structures that we set up today can handle or can set us up for being able to deal with more capable systems in the future.
So another way of having like more robust systems is having like some external team, like doing some auditing or like red teaming, I think you said at the beginning. So would you want to like have more people doing like auditing? Have you like seen more people use this at companies?
My guess is that, we're moving in the direction of more of this kind of stuff happening. I would like there to be much more. One bet that I think I forgot to mention that we might pursue as this team is this. So the bet is, how can we make it the case that sort of the world's most powerful or impactful models, that those models receive external scrutiny without that requiring that you sort of give that model to a whole bunch of different actors. Partly just because like these companies, you need to make these kinds of governance systems like incentive compatible, and so I think like you're gonna be hard pressed to get like Facebook to just like give everyone their recommender algorithm or whatever, or their like newsfeed algorithm. And so a thing that I'm like very excited about is like how can we make sure that there's more external scrutiny on these kind of things, with the thought of like as these systems become more and more capable, I think it's probably not gonna be enough if you're just relying on the developer and the deployer of the system themselves to do the vetting and do the work of figuring out whether their system is safe or not, or whether it's going to cause harm in some kind of way or whatever. And so I would love us to start moving in that general direction. To some extent, it's like some of these companies are starting to do more and more of this. Not a lot of it is, I think they could be. I don't know how much of that is sort of like is public or something that they like talk about a bunch, and I don't know like the extent to which. My guess is that I want them to do significantly more of it. And so I think that we're probably going to work on, or that we might work on, is how do we make sure that more of that happens? And so like an example of a thing that I would like to be the case is, I don't know, like at some point, like when the next like large language model gets produced by DeepMind or OpenAI or Google or whatever, when they do that, I would like it to be the case that like they usually have a section where they're like, oh, okay, well, is this model biased in some way? Could it like do something bad? Could one use it for disinformation? Whatever. These things, they usually have a section that talks about that, and they do a lot of work on it. Seems great. I want them to continue to do a lot of work on it. In my ideal world, that section is contributed to by external folks, or maybe even better, there's like, while like at the same time that they publish their main paper, there's other people who get to publish papers talking about like, oh, I ran these other tests that like the company didn't do that like showed up these results. And I also want like it seems very plausible to me that like to do really good work on how the like worlds how these like really big models how they behave and trying to understand them, trying to make them more interpretable, trying to make sure that they don't cause harm in certain ways. That's probably going to be much easier to do if you have access to the models. And so a thing that I really want to happen is these companies to do like give more researcher access basically to the models. I don't know how that will like how you could do that in practice. I think like an example of a thing that maybe could work is if the companies are very worried about like diffusion of their models or something like this, or like very worried about people being able to like get a hold of the weights or copy the model or something like this, which it seems plausible that they should be worried about as long as if they're not sort of open sourcing it, because maybe they want to make sure that they can make money off of it or whatever it is. If in that case, then a thing that you could do is something similar to like we've kind of solved this problem in other domains. So like for example, the U.S. Census, where you try to figure out how many people are there in the U.S. and what are some important traits of them or whatever, and you do this every couple of years, and then or maybe it's more than that. I don't actually know the rate. When they do that, that data is like super sensitive, and anyone can't just get access to that data. And so what they do is they have a whole host of like political scientists who get to work on this data. And the way that they do it is that they have physical machines in rooms where you can't bring in stuff. And you go into that room and those computers have the data and you get to run analyses on it. Maybe you get to run R or Python code or whatever on it. And then you get to output some results. And then maybe you can send some of those results to your home laptop so you can write up your paper or whatever. And I could imagine that like we would just want something like that. Maybe you could do that with the virtual machines. In the AI space, and yeah, that's a thing that I'm excited about, like trying to make happen or sort of agitate for companies to do.
So you just have a big room where you have like terminal computers, and you have people like trying to see if the model is aligned or not.
Yeah, exactly. I think you can also do. I mean, you can do it with like anyone who is doing work on that looks like scrutinizing these models. So I think like this. I would want this to also like I assume that there's a bunch of people who are doing like interpretability work with an aim to understanding like how can we align or like how can we make sure that like more powerful future models don't cause a bunch of harm. I think you could also like people who are doing work on like the fairness and the bias of current algorithms or the explainability of current algorithms or whatever. I would imagine that they would also benefit a whole bunch from being able to like actually work with these frontier models. And so in my ideal world, then like yeah, all of these folks would be able to get access to these kinds of models and to be able to do the research, and then like having that like setting up a system where that can be done without them these folks necessarily getting access to, or like without you needing to open source the model. Seems like that would be great to me, or like would be a really good way, like move for a really good direction for the world to move in. And yeah, hopefully we can. Maybe we'll do some work on it. Maybe we can. Yeah, I don't know. Try to get others to be excited about this view as well. I think there's also some stuff that I want to happen in this space that looks like something like, can we figure out like better privacy preserving ways or sort of using privacy enhancing technology to solve some of these problems, where like in the ideal world, what I want it to be the case that like someone or like, yeah, anyone can like access an API. In that API, what I can do is I can just put in some code. Maybe I put in some Python code or whatever that like is gonna run certain, like some kind of analysis on the on like a large language model or whatever, or on like a big old neural network. And then I want to that person to then like, maybe they don't like see anything of the internals of the model, but they get the output for what happens when you run that code. And then if you can set up that kind of system, then that might be a really good way to make sure that like other actors, like external actors, can sort of vet your model without sort of being worried about this kind of diffusion. And that might also be like super important in, like, you could imagine future worlds where like you might do that with like in much more adversarial contexts. Like you could imagine maybe you do that with like I don't know, maybe like you would imagine that like maybe there's a future where like lots of countries have lethal autonomous weapons, but we want to make sure that these lethal autonomous weapons are sort of acting in accordance with, or at least like not grossly going against international law or like humanitarian law. Like you don't want them to be programmed to, specifically target people of a certain gender or color or whatever.
So you can have autonomous weapons, but they're not allowed to target a certain.
I mean, yeah, and ideally maybe we wouldn't have autonomous weapons, but maybe that's it's difficult to like get everyone to agree on that. But maybe a thing that you can get everyone to agree on is like, okay, well, we're going to give you this like privacy preserving access to our models or to our systems, and you can run certain analyses on it to see whether it seems like it's doing the bad stuff. And if you can just sort of make sure that there's sufficient trust that you're actually running these analyses on the actual deployed model, then this could be really, really helpful, or like could be like a stabilizing thing, or could be a way in which like you could build trust or be able to like sort of implement international agreements that could be important.
Is there any regulation on autonomous weapons so far?
I mean, international regulation, no. Or like international law stuff, no. There's a bunch of discussion about like how does the international law that we have apply to these systems. But in general, like international law is, it's like a difficult thing because it's like there's no one to enforce it. And so it's like, it's more like a lot of the times what it looks like it's sort of norm setting, or like maybe like if you like grossly violate international law, then that might give other actors reason to like intervene. So like, yeah, in Syria, you start using chemical weapons, and then the rest of the world gets angry with you, or like thinks that you've like done something really, really bad, and it increases the chance that you'll be invaded, or like they'll intervene via airstrikes or whatever. And so that's the only kinds of mechanisms that we can enforce international law.
If I were to tell you that I don't know, the year is somewhere in the 21st century, and Markus Anderljung, I don't know how to pronounce your name, sorry, is dead.
Uh-huh.
What would you say is the probability that you were killed by autonomous weapon versus like autonomous AI, those kind of things? Like what is it, like the scenario you imagine for yourself? Just like die like old in some kind of like weird like hospital room where you can like play with like DALL-E 10.
Yeah. What was the year?
I don't know. Somewhere in the 21st century.
Yeah, I don't know how I'm gonna die. That would be probably great to know. I think I would probably say yes if if someone asked me if I wanted to find out. Seems like that would be useful knowledge. Yeah, I don't really know. What's the chance that I die from a lethal autonomous weapons thing? It seems low. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe it depends on how. Yeah, maybe if I end up being like super important or something like this, which seems unlikely. But if I end up being super important, maybe I'll get assassinated at some point. We'll see.
Cool. Hopefully, people can watch this video and see the alive Markus before you get like very famous.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
as the head of the entire universe government.
Exactly. Yeah. When I become head of policy for the world, then yeah.
Do you have a final speech about your takes on AI policy or just like AI in general?
Yeah, I don't really know. I think all of these questions I think are really, really important. I think if you are a person who is like interested in how AI is going to have an impact on the world, I think it's very plausible that work that tries to figure out some of these style of questions about that is on the governance side of things, that is about sort of how we can make sure that the world takes good, useful, sane actions on how to deal with potential risks from AI and like how to communicate those risks and all those kinds of questions, I think are like very, very important. And I think that like the case in favor of you thinking about whether you can contribute to that kind of stuff, I think is high. And you should, I would be excited about you doing that. Yeah. And then hopefully we can figure out how to govern this technology as it gets more and more capable.
Cool. Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you.
Likewise. This is great.